The cabin sat low against the prairie, a single dark shape under a sky the color of old iron. Inside, Evelyn Harper stood at the cold hearth with her hand resting on the mantel, and she counted the silver coins in the small leather pouch for the third time that week. $4.18. She knew the figure by heart, but she counted anyway, as if the numbers might change if she stared long enough at the tarnished quarters and the thin dimes. The fire had gone out an hour ago, and she had not bothered to relight it. There was no wood to spare for warmth when the daylight gave enough light to see the cupboards. The cupboards were bare except for half a sack of cornmeal, a crock of lard, a tin of salt, 3 jars of pickled beans, and a wedge of cheese the size of her palm. That was the sum of her winter. That, and the 3 hens who had stopped laying in the cold, and the milk cow whose bag had thinned, and the vegetable patch out back where the drought had taken everything but the weeds. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier. Stories of women who were laughed at, counted out, and left for broke, but who found a way where no one else thought to look. Evelyn Harper was such a woman, and this is her story. She had not always been alone. Her father had died the winter before, pneumonia taking him in 3 days, and her mother had followed him in the spring, as if she had only been waiting for permission to let go. Evelyn was 23 now, the last of the Harpers on this narrow strip of bottomland 2 miles east of Council Bluffs, where the Missouri River ran slow and muddy through the October fog. There were neighbors, the Pickerings to the north, the Vance family across the creek, the Brennan boys on the high ground, and they had been kind in the weeks after the funerals. Mrs. Vance brought a pot of stew. The Brennan boys patched a hole in the roof, but kindness, Evelyn had learned, was a finite thing in a hard country, and after the second month the visits grew thin. The land was tired, and so was she. On the first Saturday of October, she drove the wagon into town to trade 2 dozen eggs for a sack of beans. Her route took her past the butcher shop on Pearl Street, and she saw old Mr. Hodge standing in the doorway with a piglet under one arm. The animal was scarcely larger than a loaf of bread, a runt of the spring litter, pink and brown and shivering. Its eyes were dark and wet, fixed on her with a frantic, searching attention. Mr. Hodge saw her looking and called out, "2 bits for this one, Miss Harper. Won't grow to bake and wait before the cold. I'll take what I can get." Evelyn meant to nod and drive on. She meant to. But the piglet let out a small, high cry, and her foot found the brake before her mind found a reason. She sat there on the wagon seat for what felt like a long time, the reins loose in her hands, while the piglet shivered against the butcher's apron. 25 cents, a quarter of a dollar. It was nothing, and it was everything. A quarter would buy her 2 pounds of beans, or 3 pounds of flour, or a bottle of liniment for Buttercup's sore hock. A quarter set against her $4.18 was more than a 20th of all she had in the world. And what would she do with a piglet? She could not eat it. She knew herself well enough to know that. She had named every chicken her mother had ever raised, and she had cried each time one ended in the stew pot. A piglet, small and shivering, looking at her like that, would never become a ham in her hands. She would feed it. She would shelter it. She would grow attached. And in a year it would be a great snorting pig of 300 pounds, eating her out of cabin and barn, and she would still not be able to kill it. She thought of her mother, who had once spent the household's spare nickel on a stray cat with a broken leg. Her father had grumbled for a week. The cat lived 11 years and caught more mice than any cat in the county. She thought of old Mrs. Pickering, who would surely hear about this within an hour of it happening, and who would tell the story at every quilting bee from now until Christmas. She thought of the cupboard, the half sack of cornmeal, the thin wedge of cheese. "Mercy, don't fill a stomach," Mrs. Pickering had said. Evelyn closed her eyes. She heard the piglet cry again, a sound like a baby's hiccup, and something in her chest moved against her better judgment, against her good sense, against every careful calculation she had made on Sunday evenings with the leather pouch open on the kitchen table. She climbed down from the wagon. She walked across the muddy street. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out a single silver quarter, and she placed it in Mr. Hodge's broad red hand. He looked at her like she had lost her wits. Then he shrugged, and he passed her the warm, trembling little body, and she tucked it inside her coat. The ride home was long. The piglet slept against her ribs, breathing in fast, soft puffs, and Evelyn felt the weight of what she had done settle over her like a damp shawl. By the time she turned into her own lane, 2 neighbors had already seen her with the bundle and pointed. By the time she reached her door, she could almost hear the gossip racing ahead of her across the bottomlands. She lit a fire in the stove. She warmed a tin of milk. She set the piglet on a folded blanket in the corner and watched it root blindly at the wool, snuffling and content. "Well," she said aloud to the empty room, "I suppose your name had better be Pearl." If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. Because the story of Evelyn Harper was only just beginning. That evening, after the chores were done, Evelyn sat by the stove with Pearl curled in her lap and thought about her mother. Her mother had kept a small, leather-bound book of household notes, and Evelyn had not opened it since the funeral. She fetched it now from the trunk under the bed. The pages smelled of dried lavender. She turned them slowly, reading the small, careful hand, recipes, remedies, a note about a neighbor's kindness, and on one page, underlined twice, "The land remembers what it has grown. Watch what the animals show you." Evelyn read the line 3 times, then closed the book. Pearl took to the cabin with the easy confidence of a creature who had never doubted she belonged there. She slept in the blanket-lined crate by the stove. She trotted at Evelyn's heels when chores were done. She learned within 3 days to come when called and to sit quivering with hope beside the table at mealtimes. Evelyn fed her potato peelings and corn mush and the rind of the small cheese, and Pearl ate everything with the same astonished gratitude. By the 2nd week, word had spread. Mrs. Pickering came calling on a Tuesday morning, ostensibly to return a borrowed sieve, and stood in the doorway with her mouth pursed like a drawstring. "So it's true," she said. "It's true," Evelyn said. "You bought a pig. I bought a piglet. You spent 25 cents of your last dollars on a pig you don't mean to eat. That's about the size of it." Mrs. Pickering shook her head slowly, with the deep, patient sorrow of a woman watching a younger woman ruin her own life. "Evelyn Harper, your mother would have wept." "My mother once spent a nickel on a cat," Evelyn said. Mrs. Pickering left the sieve on the table and went home. The Vance children came next, 3 of them, peering through the window with great solemn eyes until Evelyn invited them in. They crouched around Pearl on the floor and stroked her bristly little back and gasped in delight when she rolled over for a belly rub. The youngest, a boy of 6 named Henry, asked very seriously whether the pig knew her own name, and Evelyn said she believed so. Pearl, in fact, came when called, and Henry declared it the finest thing he had ever seen. But the children's mother, when she came to collect them, did not smile. Mrs. Vance stood in the yard with her hands on her hips and looked at the cabin and the leaning coop and the thin chimney smoke. "Evelyn, dear, we can spare a little if you need." "I'm fine," Evelyn said. "You bought a pig you can't eat. I know what I did." "For the love of heaven, why?" Evelyn did not have an answer that would satisfy. She had only the memory of a small, wet eye and a thin cry, and she could not put that into words that would not sound foolish to a woman with 4 children and a tight budget. So she only said, "It made sense at the time." And Mrs. Vance sighed and gathered her children and walked them home. The Brennan boys, when they heard, laughed. They came riding past on a Saturday afternoon and called out from their saddles, "Hey there, Miss Harper. Heard you bought yourself a husband." And the older one, Clay, doffed his hat and said, "Save me a chop when she's grown." The younger one, Jim, slapped his thigh and roared. Evelyn waved them on with a polite smile and said nothing, but her cheeks burned, and she went inside and sat with Pearl in her lap and did not come out until supper. The hardest visit was the Reverend Mr. Coffey, who came on a cold Wednesday in his black coat and stood by the stove, rubbing his thin hands together. He had baptized her. He had buried her parents. He looked at Pearl, who was rooting peacefully at his bootlaces, and his face arranged itself into the careful concern of a man preparing to deliver an unwelcome sermon. "Evelyn," he said, "Sister, I have heard the talk in town. I imagine you have. They say you have given way to softness, that you have wasted what little you had. Is it true that you bought a pig you will not slaughter?" "It is true," And that your cupboards are bare? They are not bare, they are thin. He looked at her for a long moment. The Lord helps those who help themselves, Evelyn. I am helping myself, Reverend. By feeding a pig out of an empty larder? She did not know how to answer that. She poured him a cup of weak tea, and she listened to him pray over her household, and she thanked him when he left. Then she shut the door and sat down on the floor beside the crate. And Pearl came over and laid her warm, bristly head against Evelyn's knee. And Evelyn cried for the first time since her mother's funeral, quietly and without bitterness, into the warm, small back of a creature who did not know what she was worth. Through October, Pearl grew. She was still small, but the runt had begun to fill out on cabbage cores and apple peels, and the last of the garden's bruised tomatoes. Her coat was coarse and bristly, and her belly was a soft pink drum, and her ears flopped over her bright black eyes in a way that made Evelyn laugh aloud, which she had not done in months. Evelyn began letting Pearl out into the yard during the warm hours of the day. The piglet had a passionate interest in the world. She investigated the hens, who treated her with the lofty contempt of established residents. She investigated the cow, who tolerated her with mild surprise. She investigated the woodpile, the rain barrel, the boot scraper by the door, and a leaning fence post that fascinated her for an entire afternoon. But what Pearl loved most was the old patch behind the cabin. The forgotten garden where Evelyn's father had said nothing would grow. The bramble-choked square of weedy ground that had been written off years ago. Evelyn watched her from the kitchen window the first time Pearl wandered back there. The piglet stood in the tangled grass, her nose lifted, sniffing. Then she lowered her snout and began to root. She worked at one spot with a kind of focused industry that Evelyn had not yet seen in her. Dirt flew up around her ears. She grunted, soft and pleased. Evelyn thought little of it. Piglets rooted. That was what piglets did. She turned back to the bread she was kneading. By the third afternoon, Pearl was spending hours back there. She came to her supper bowl with her snout caked in black soil. She rooted in her sleep, her little hooves twitching against the blanket. Evelyn began to think there must be a mouse nest, or perhaps an old bone the dog had buried in her father's time. On the fifth afternoon, Evelyn went to fetch her in for supper, and she stopped at the edge of the patch and stared. Pearl had dug a small crater. Around the crater, scattered in the freshly turned earth, were a dozen knobby brown things that looked at first like rocks, then like potatoes, then like something Evelyn had not seen since she was a little girl. She knelt down. She picked one up. It was firm and pale-fleshed where Pearl's teeth had nicked it, and it gave off a faint, sweet, earthy smell that took Evelyn straight back to her grandmother's kitchen in Pennsylvania, where the old woman had served them as a child, sliced and fried in butter, calling them by their old name. Sunchokes, Jerusalem artichokes, the hardy native tuber that grew wild across the prairies and the river bottoms, that her grandmother had said would keep a family alive in a hard year, that her own father had dismissed as a weed crop fit only for hogs. Evelyn looked at the patch. She looked at the piglet, who was peering up at her with mud on her nose and triumph in her small dark eyes. She looked at the patch again. Then she went into the cabin and fetched a shovel and a basket, and she came back out, and she got down on her knees in the cold dirt beside Pearl, and she began to dig. She worked until the sun went down. She worked by lantern after that. Pearl rooted alongside her, and every clod Evelyn turned over revealed more of them, knobs and clusters and chains of pale tubers, some the size of marbles, some the size of her fist, hundreds of them, thousands of them, packed into the dark soil beneath the tangled grass. The old garden, she realized, was not a failed garden at all. Someone at some point, perhaps her grandmother on a visit decades ago, perhaps a settler before her family ever bought the land, had planted Jerusalem artichokes here. And the tubers, which would grow in any soil, which spread on their own, which survived drought and frost and neglect, had been quietly multiplying in the cold dark for years, maybe a generation, maybe two. Her father, looking at the tall yellow flowers in the summer and the dead stalks in the winter, had thought it was a weed patch. Her father, who had grown up on bread and potatoes and pork, had not known what lay an inch beneath his boots. Evelyn sat back on her heels in the lantern light, her hands black with earth, her basket already heavy. She looked at Pearl. Pearl looked at her. The piglet's tail wagged once, businesslike, and she returned to her digging. "Oh, my girl," Evelyn whispered. "Oh, my good, clever girl." By the end of that night, she had filled 4 baskets. By the end of the next day, she had filled 8. She brought them into the cabin and spread them on newspapers on the floor, and they covered nearly the whole of one room. She washed a small handful, sliced them, and fried them in lard with salt, and she ate them at her kitchen table while Pearl crunched a few raw from a tin bowl. And Evelyn thought she had not tasted anything so good in 2 years. That night she sat by the stove with her mother's book open in her lap, and she read the underlined sentence again, and this time she laughed out loud and could not stop. But knowing she had food and being safe were not the same thing. The frost set in hard the second week of November. The river skinned over at the edges. The wind came down out of the north with a sharp, dry bite that scoured the bottomlands and rattled the cabin shutters all night long. And Evelyn, looking at her hundreds of pounds of sunchokes spread across the floor, understood that she had a different problem now. She did not know how to keep them. Potatoes, she knew. Potatoes you piled in the root cellar in straw, and they kept till spring. Cabbages you wrapped in newspaper. Apples you laid out single in the loft. But Jerusalem artichokes were thinner-skinned, more delicate, prone to shriveling in dry air and rotting in damp. Her grandmother had known the trick of it. Her grandmother was 20 years in her grave. She tried the root cellar first. She built small mounds of straw and laid the tubers in, and within 3 days the ones nearest the wall had gone soft and dark. She moved them. She tried sand. The sand drew the moisture out of them, and they wrinkled like old apples. She tried wrapping them in damp cloth, and the cloth grew a green fur of mold within a week. She lost 20 pounds the first try. She lost 30 pounds the second try. She sat on the cellar steps with her face in her hands and felt the cold weight of what she had nearly thrown away. This gift from the earth, this miracle her piglet had uncovered, and she could not bear it. She thought of who in the county would know. Her grandmother's generation was gone. The few old folks left at the church social were Yankee farmers who grew wheat and corn, and they would look at her sideways for asking. Then she thought of one name, old Mrs. Strand, the Norwegian widow who lived in a sod-roofed cabin 3 miles upriver, whom everyone considered odd because she still spoke half in the old tongue and refused to attend the Methodist church. Mrs. Strand had been a girl on this land before the railroad came through. Mrs. Strand grew strange, dark vegetables in a strange, dark garden, and Evelyn's mother had once said the woman could keep a turnip fresh for a year. Evelyn put on her good coat and walked the 3 miles upriver with 3 of her best tubers wrapped in a cloth. Mrs. Strand was in her yard splitting kindling with a hatchet, a tiny, stooped woman in 3 shawls and a man's hat. She looked up at Evelyn's approach, and her sharp blue eyes narrowed, and then she nodded once, as if she had been expecting her. "You are the Harper girl," she said. "The one with the pig?" "Yes, ma'am." "They say you are a fool." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Strand barked out one short laugh. "Come in then, fool." In the dim cabin over a cup of black coffee, Evelyn unwrapped her tubers and laid them on the table. Mrs. Strand looked at them, and her whole hard little face changed. She picked one up and held it to her nose and breathed in deep. She said something in Norwegian, soft and almost reverent. She set it down and looked at Evelyn. "How many?" she said. "Hundreds of pounds. Maybe more. I haven't dug the whole patch." "And you do not know how to keep them?" "No, ma'am." Mrs. Strand stood. She fetched down a tin from a high shelf, and inside the tin were 2 folded papers covered in spidery handwriting. She did not give them to Evelyn. She read aloud from them slowly while Evelyn took notes on the back of an envelope with a stub of pencil. "You did not store them like potatoes. You stored them like carrots in damp sand at a precise temperature. You left some of them in the ground where the frost itself would keep them, and you dug them as you needed them. You sliced others and dried them on a rack near the stove for winter stews. And you saved the smallest, the ones with knobby eyes, for replanting in the spring." Evelyn walked home through the bitter dusk, with the envelope folded carefully in her pocket and a small loaf of dark Norwegian bread tucked under her arm, a gift Mrs. Strand had pressed on her at the door, brushing aside thanks. By the time she reached her cabin, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, fine and dry as sifted flour. She built her storage that night, working late into the cold by lantern light. She layered damp sand in wooden crates from the loft. She buried tubers in the sand with the careful spacing Mrs. Strand had described. She marked one large square of the original patch with stakes and a string, and left it untouched to be a winter pantry under the snow. She set up a drying rack on a high shelf near the stove, and she sliced the smaller tubers thin and laid them out in rows. Pearl, who had grown noticeably in the past 3 weeks and was now too large for the kitchen blanket, watched all of this from her new straw bed in the corner of the lean-to, occasionally offering a low, pleased grunt that Evelyn took as approval. In the morning, she dug into the cellar and found that her stored tubers by Mrs. Strand's method were firm and fragrant. Not one had softened. She nearly wept with relief. But trouble does not announce itself once and leave. It comes in a procession. The third Tuesday of November, a man came up her lane in a black buggy. He was a thin man in a dark suit, with a clean-shaven face and a clerical collar of paper, which meant he was not the Reverend Coffee, but somebody from the county. He introduced himself as Mr. Wendell Pratt, agent for the Pottawatomie County tax assessor, and he had come to inform her that the property tax on her late father's land was due before the end of November. "How much?" Evelyn asked. "$6.40, Miss Harper." She felt the floor tilt under her. She had $3.93. "You have until the 30th, Mr. Pratt said, not unkindly. He had a thin gray face and tired eyes. "If you cannot pay, the county will place a lien against the property, and in the spring it will be advertised for sale at auction. I am sorry, Miss Harper. The law is the law." He left a slip of paper on her table. He drove away in his black buggy. The snow had begun again, thicker now. Evelyn stood in her doorway and watched him go, and the wind came in around her ankles, and she felt something close to despair. $6.40. By the end of the month, she had $3.93, and a piglet, and a cabin, and a cow with thinning milk, and 4 baskets of stored tubers, and a winter coming on. But she also had, she realized slowly as she stood there in the cold, an idea. She had a great deal of food, hundreds of pounds of food, far more than one woman and one piglet could eat in a winter, even a long one. And in Council Bluffs, where the railroad had brought new families and new restaurants and new appetites for novelty, there were people who paid coin for unusual vegetables. The German baker on Broadway had bought her mother's parsnips at a fair price the previous winter. The hotel on Pearl Street served 3 meals a day to traveling men. The grocery on Main carried out-of-season produce from as far as St. Louis. She did not have to keep her secret. She did not have to hide her harvest. She could carry it into town. She could ask a fair price. And if the people who had laughed at her bought her tubers at a nickel a pound, then so be it. Their nickels would be just as good as anyone's. She sat at the table that evening with the tax notice in front of her and made a list. Buyers to try, prices to ask, baskets to weave. By the time she went to bed, the snow had stopped and the moon was up and her plan was full grown. The Monday she meant to make her first trip into town, she woke to find Pearl shivering and would not rise. The piglet's eyes were dull. Her flank felt hot. She had thrown up her supper in the night, and she would not touch the dish of milk. Evelyn sat down beside her straw bed and laid a hand on her warm, bristly side, and felt her own heart go to ice. Outside, the snow was deep and white and indifferent. Mr. Pratt's deadline was 12 days away. Her piglet, her clever girl, her whole reason for any of this was sick, and Evelyn did not know what was wrong, and she did not know what to do. By noon on the second day, Pearl's breathing had eased. Her flank was still hot to the touch, but the shallow pant had slowed, and when Evelyn came in from the woodpile, the piglet lifted her head and blinked at her with something like recognition. Evelyn knelt beside the straw bed and pressed her cheek against the coarse bristle of Pearl's shoulder. She did not pray aloud. She had used up all her words the night before, standing in the snow under the sharp stars. And now she only stayed there, breathing in the warm animal smell of her, waiting for the small chest to rise and fall beneath her hand. It rose. It fell. It rose again. Pearl grunted once, softly, and laid her head back down. By the third morning the fever had broken. Pearl stood on wobbly legs and nosed at the dish of warm milk Evelyn set before her, then drank it down in long, gulping swallows. By the fourth morning she was rooting at her straw and grumbling for breakfast in her old, impatient way, and Evelyn, half laughing and half crying, fed her tuber mash from her own bowl. The sickness had passed, but it had cost Evelyn nearly a week. Mr. Pratt's deadline was now 6 days away, and she had not sold a single tuber. She loaded the wagon the next morning before the sun was fully up. 8 baskets of Jerusalem artichokes, scrubbed clean and gleaming pale under the cloudy sky. She brushed her hair until it shone. She put on her mother's good wool coat, the one with the bone buttons that had been saved for Sundays. She set Pearl on a folded quilt on the seat beside her, because she could not bear to leave her behind so soon after the sickness, and besides, she had come to think of the piglet as her partner in this enterprise, and partners traveled together. The road into Council Bluffs was rutted and half frozen, and the wagon creaked through the cold like an old man groaning in his sleep. Pearl sat upright beside her, ears flopping, nostrils working at the unfamiliar smells of chimney smoke and horse manure and the distant salt tang of the slaughterhouse. Evelyn drove first to Mr. Hodge's butcher shop on Pearl Street because she felt she owed him the first call. He came to the door wiping his hands on his apron, and he looked at the pig on the wagon seat, and his eyebrows climbed his forehead. "Miss Harper," he said. "She grew." "She did. That the pig I sold you?" "It is." He looked at her. He looked at the piglet, who was inspecting his shop with great interest. "Looks happy." "She is." "Well, I'll be." She told him then about the patch, about the tubers, about how Pearl had found them. Mr. Hodge listened with his arms folded over his big chest, and when she was done he said, "Bring me a basket. I'll give you 60 cents for 10 pounds, and I'll tell every man who comes through my door." She left a basket. 60 cents went into her leather pouch, her first sale. She drove next to Hoffman's Bakery on Broadway. Mr. Hoffman was a square, red-faced man from Hamburg who spoke careful English. He came out of his kitchen smelling of yeast, and when she showed him the tubers, he picked one up and broke it in his hand and smelled it, and his eyes brightened. "Topinambur," he said. "Ja, my grandmother grew these. I have not seen them since I was a boy." He bought 20 pounds at 6 cents a pound. He said he would make them into a soup for the church supper, and if his customers liked them, he would buy more. He shook her hand. His palm was warm with flour. She drove to the Grand Hotel on Pearl Street, and the German cook in the kitchen took 30 pounds at 7 cents a pound. He said he would prepare them for the dining room that very evening, sliced and fried in butter with parsley, the way they did them in Hanover. She drove to the grocery on Main, and the proprietor, Mr. Steinberg, who had served her family for years, shook his head and laughed and said he had not seen Jerusalem artichokes since his mother's table in Cincinnati. He bought a basket at 5 cents a pound and said he would put them in the window with a sign explaining what they were. By 3 in the afternoon, Evelyn was driving home with an empty wagon and a leather pouch heavier than it had been in 18 months. $2.90 added to her existing $3.93. She had $6.83. She had her tax payment and 43 cents to spare. She sat on the wagon seat with the reins loose in her hands and the wind in her face, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry. Pearl grunted beside her, satisfied, as if she had known all along how the day would go. She paid Mr. Pratt the next morning. She laid out the coins on her kitchen table, $6.40 in clean silver, and he counted them twice and wrote her a receipt with a flourish of his pen. "Paid in full," he said, and he looked at her with something like respect. "Miss Harper, I confess I had my doubts." "So did I," she said. She saw the receipt pinned to the mantel that evening and stood looking at it for a long time. It was the first piece of paper in that house that did not speak of loss. But the mockery did not stop. If anything, it sharpened. Mrs. Pickering came to town the same week and saw the basket of tubers in Mr. Steinberg's window with the hand-lettered sign, "Jerusalem artichokes, fresh from the Harper farm, 5 cents a pound." She stood on the sidewalk with her hands on her hips and said loud enough for the entire block to hear, "Well, I never. Hog feed in a grocery window. What will they think of next?" Two women standing beside her clucked in agreement. Evelyn heard about it from the baker's boy, who delivered bread to her lane and repeated the remark with a grin. She said nothing. She had a receipt on her mantel and $6.83 in her pouch, and Mrs. Pickering had only her opinion. The Brennan boys came by again in December, this time not on horseback but in a wagon full of fence posts they were hauling to the high meadow. They saw Pearl in the yard, now a solid young hog of nearly 60 pounds, and they slowed the team. "Heard you been selling weeds in town," Clay called out. "Heard you been making money off them," Jim added. His voice was less mocking than it had been, as if the idea had unsettled him. "I have been selling vegetables," Evelyn said, standing at the woodpile with a split log in her hands. "The same vegetables my grandmother ate, and her grandmother before her." Clay Brennan spat into the snow and shook his head. "Still ain't proper farming." "It's feeding me," she said. "Is your corn feeding you?" The question hung in the cold air. Clay's mouth tightened. Jim looked away. The corn crop on the high ground had been thin that year, the drought having taken most of it, and the Brennan boys had lost nearly half their herd to a poor hay harvest. They knew it, and Evelyn knew it, and the silence that followed was the closest thing to an admission she was likely to get. Clay clucked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, and they did not look back. But they did not laugh either. That winter, the cold came early and stayed late. By the middle of December, the Missouri had frozen solid from bank to bank, and the steamboats that had run as late as November were locked in ice at their docks. The railroad line from Omaha struggled with drifts that buried the tracks for days at a time. The town supply lines grew thin. Flour climbed to 12 cents a pound. Sugar vanished from the shelves altogether. And the families who had counted on their root sellers to see them through found the potatoes rotting and the apples shriveled. The Brennan boys lost another dozen head of cattle to the cold, their hay having run out in January. The Vance family, who had 4 children and a tight budget, ate corn mush for breakfast, lunch, and supper until the children cried at the sight of it. Mrs. Pickering, who had put up 50 quarts of green beans and 30 of tomato preserves, discovered in February that a warm spell in January had fooled her cellar into thawing, and half her stores had spoiled. She did not speak of it, but the rumor reached Evelyn through the baker's boy, who heard it from the postmaster's wife. Evelyn's cabin sat warm and quiet through the worst of it. She had her damp sand crates in the cellar, and the tubers held firm. She had her drying rack by the stove, and the sliced rounds went into stews and soups. She had the marked patch in the yard, buried under 2 feet of snow, and she knew that when the ground thawed, there would be more waiting. She did not go hungry. She did not even go lean. She shared what she could spare. On a bitter January night, she walked a basket of dried sunchokes to the Vance farm, and Mrs. Vance wept into her apron and said she would repay her somehow. Evelyn told her not to think of it. She left a smaller basket on Mrs. Pickering's porch in the dark, not wanting the old woman to know where it came from. She found it unopened on the porch the next morning, left out in the cold, and she took it home again without a word. By the end of February, the town was in a quiet panic. The stores were nearly empty. The hotel had reduced its menu to boiled potatoes and salt pork. The baker had stopped baking bread because he could not get flour, and his yeast had died in the cold. Evelyn had sold most of her stored crop by then, but she still had the patch under the snow, and she still had the dried rounds, and she still had enough to last until spring. She was not the richest woman in the county, but she was the only one who was not afraid. Word traveled. People began to come to her door. They came in ones and twos, bundled in whatever they had, walking across the frozen fields to ask if she had any to spare. Evelyn sold what she could and gave what she could not bring herself to charge for. The German baker bought the last of her dried rounds and made a soup that he sold from a kettle on his counter, and the smell of it drew people from 3 blocks away. The cook at the Grand Hotel sent a boy with a note begging for another 50 pounds, and Evelyn had to write back that she had only 30 left in the cellar, and those she was keeping for seed. The boy returned with a counteroffer, 10 cents a pound, cash in hand. She sold him 20 and kept 10 for planting. And then, on the first day of March, the blizzard came. It arrived without warning, a wall of white that rolled down from the north in the middle of the night and buried the bottomlands under 6 feet of snow before dawn. The wind tore the shutters off Evelyn's cabin and sent them spinning into the dark. The lean-to where Pearl slept groaned and shifted, and Evelyn stumbled out in her nightdress and her boots, half blind in the driving snow, and pulled Pearl into the cabin through the back door. They spent the next 3 days huddled by the stove, Evelyn feeding the fire with wood she had stacked in the corner, Pearl lying on a heap of quilts with her snout tucked under Evelyn's arm. The wind screamed, the cabin shook, the world outside turned to a white nothing that erased the fence line, the road, the river, the sky. When it finally stopped on the 4th morning, Evelyn opened the door to a silence so deep it hurt her ears. The snow had drifted to the eaves of the cabin. The lane was gone. The road to town was impassable. She could not see the Vance farm, could not see the river, could not see anything but a white plain that stretched in every direction under a pale blue sky. She stood in the doorway with Pearl crowding behind her, and she felt a cold fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had enough food for herself and for Pearl, and for maybe another month if she stretched it, but she had no way to reach town, and no way for town to reach her. The first sign of life came on the 5th day. A figure appeared on the white horizon, small and dark and moving slowly, and Evelyn watched it grow larger until she recognized the stooped shoulders and the 3 shawls and the man's hat. Mrs. Strand had walked 3 miles through snow that came up to her knees, carrying a bundle on her back. She collapsed on Evelyn's doorstep, and Evelyn pulled her inside and sat her by the fire and poured hot broth into her hands until the color came back to her cheeks. Mrs. Strand had come to warn her. The town was in trouble. The baker had run out of wood and was burning his own furniture. The hotel had closed its dining room. The railroad had not run in 2 weeks, and no one knew when it would run again. People were hungry, truly hungry now, and they were starting to remember who had food. "They know about your patch," Mrs. Strand said, her voice thin and cracked. "They will come." Evelyn looked out the window at the endless white. She thought of her tubers in the cellar, the 10 pounds she had saved for seed, the dried rounds in the tin by the stove. She thought of the patch buried under 6 feet of snow, unreachable until the thaw. She thought of the Vance children, and the baker, and the cook at the hotel, and Mrs. Pickering's unopened basket. And she thought of the Brennan boys and their dead cattle. "Let them come," she said. But that night, as the wind picked up again and the cabin creaked in the cold, Evelyn lay awake and listened to Pearl's steady breathing and wondered if she had enough. Not just of food, but of strength. The mockery had stopped, but something harder was taking its place. People were no longer laughing at her, they were watching her. And watching, in a hungry winter, was a dangerous thing. The silence after the blizzard was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. Evelyn stood at her window each morning and watched the white plain stretch to the horizon, unbroken except for the black thread of the river where the current had cut through the ice. No smoke rose from the Vance farm. No sound of axes came from the Brennan spread. The world had gone still, and the stillness felt like waiting. On the 8th day, a knock came at her door. It was not the tentative rap of a neighbor asking for a cup of sugar. It was 3 hard blows, spaced apart, deliberate. Evelyn opened the door to find 5 men standing in the snow. They were not armed, but they did not need to be. Their faces told the story. Hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that had stopped pleading and started calculating. At the front stood Clay Brennan, his beard crusted with ice, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a coat that had lost half its buttons. Behind him were 3 men Evelyn knew only by sight, farmers from the east side of the river who had lost their crops to the drought and their livestock to the cold. And behind them, almost hidden in their shadow, stood the Reverend Coffey, his black coat white with frost at the shoulders, his thin hands clasped in front of him like a man who had come to pray but was not sure anyone was listening. "Miss Harper," Clay said. His voice was flat, stripped of the old mockery. "We need to talk." She stepped back and let them in. They filled the small cabin, crowding around the stove, dripping meltwater onto the floorboards. Pearl, who had been dozing in her corner, rose and stood behind Evelyn's legs, her bristles raised. Evelyn set a kettle on the stove. She did not offer food. She did not have to. The smell of the broth, thin as it was, made the men's eyes track the pot like dogs watching a bone. "I know what you've got," Clay said. "Everybody knows. You got a cellar full of them artichokes. You've been selling them all winter. You've got money in your pouch and food in your larder, and we got nothing." "I have a cellar with some tubers," Evelyn said. "Not a full one. I sold most of them before the blizzard. What I have left, I'm saving for seed." "Seed," one of the East Side farmers repeated, and the word came out bitter. "Seed don't feed a man tonight. It feeds him next winter. Next winter don't matter if we don't make it through this one." The Reverend Coffee cleared his throat. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft and careful, "I have been to every house in the congregation. The Vance family has been living on boiled cornmeal for a week. The Pickerings have nothing but pickled beans. The Brennan boys lost the rest of their herd to the cold. There are children going to bed hungry, and some of them are not getting up in the morning with color in their cheeks. The town is desperate, and you have the only food in 20 miles that is still edible." "I have a patch underground that I cannot reach until the thaw," Evelyn said. "I have 10 pounds of dried rounds in a tin. I have the sand crates in the cellar, and those I am keeping for planting. If I sell them now, I will have nothing to put in the ground in April. And then where will we be next winter? Begging again?" Clay Brennan's jaw tightened. "We ain't asking you to give it away. We'll pay. We got a little left." "With what? The bank is frozen. The railroad is shut. Your money is only good if I can spend it, and I cannot spend it on food that does not exist." The men looked at each other. The East Side farmer, whose name Evelyn learned was Mr. Hargrove, stepped forward. He was a stooped man with a gray beard and eyes that seemed to have sunk back into his skull. "Miss Harper, my wife is sick. She cannot keep down cornmeal. She needs something with substance. I am not asking for your seed. I am asking for whatever you can spare. I will pay you back in labor come spring. I will work your fields for a month. I will build you a new barn if you want one. I just need something to keep her alive." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at his cracked hands, his thin coat, the desperate set of his shoulders. She thought of her mother's book, the sentence about the land remembering. She thought of Mrs. Strand's gift, the dark bread that had come with no strings attached. And she thought of the town that had laughed at her, mocked her for buying a pig she could not eat, and now stood in her kitchen with empty bellies and hollow eyes. "Sit down," she said, "all of you." She ladled broth into tin cups, thin but hot, with shavings of dried tuber floating in it. She handed the cups around. The men drank in silence, their hands shaking. Clay Brennan took his cup and held it for a long moment without drinking, staring into the steam as if it held an answer. Then he raised it to his lips and drank, and something in his face softened, the hard edge of desperation worn smooth by the simple warmth of the liquid. "I will sell you what I can spare from the dried rounds," Evelyn said. "I will sell it at the same price I sold to the baker, 5 cents a pound. But I will not touch the seed stock, and I will not dig the patch until the ground thaws. That is my final word." Mr. Hargrove nodded. The other farmers nodded. Clay Brennan set down his cup and looked at her, and for the first time in all the months she had known him, he did not look at her like she was a fool. "Much obliged," he said, and that was all. They left with a basket of dried rounds, paid for in silver that Evelyn counted and set aside. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the weight of what she had given away, and the weight of what she had kept, and the cold knowledge that the winter was not over. The dried rounds would not last the town a week. The seed stock would not feed a single hungry child. The patch under the snow was her only real supply, and it was locked away until the earth decided to release it. 2 days later, Mrs. Pickering came. She did not knock. She opened the door and walked in as if she still owned the right, and she stood in the middle of the room with her coat still on and her arms crossed. Evelyn was at the table, sorting the last of the dried rounds into a tin. She did not look up. "I heard you sold food to those men," Mrs. Pickering said. "I did." "I heard you charged them." "I did." "Your own neighbors, your own church, people you have known your whole life, and you charged them." Evelyn set down a dried round and looked at Mrs. Pickering. The old woman's face was pinched, not with hunger. Evelyn could see that she had not missed many meals, but with something else. Outrage, perhaps. Or the bitter realization that the girl she had dismissed as a fool had become a person of consequence. "I charged them what I charged the baker," Evelyn said. "I charged them less than the hotel paid. And I gave them broth before they left, which I did not charge for at all. What have you given them, Mrs. Pickering?" The old woman's mouth opened and closed. "I have given what I can." "You have a root cellar, I know you do. You put up 50 quarts of beans and 30 of tomato preserves. I saw you do it. The warm spell in January spoiled half of them, but the other half is still there. You have not opened your door to a single person this winter. You left my basket on the porch in the snow. You let it freeze rather than accept help from a woman you called a fool. And now you stand in my kitchen and tell me I should have given my food away for nothing." Mrs. Pickering's face went white, then red. "You have no right to speak to me that way. I have every right. This is my house. That is my food. And I have fed more people in the past week than you have fed all winter. If you came for help, I will give it. If you came to judge me, you can leave." Mrs. Pickering stood motionless for a long moment. Her hands trembled at her sides. Then she turned and walked out, closing the door behind her with a soft click that was somehow louder than a slam. Evelyn sat back down at the table. Pearl came over and laid her head on Evelyn's knee, and Evelyn stroked her ears and said nothing. The next week was the hardest. The cold did not let up. The snow did not melt. The sun appeared for a few hours each day, pale and weak, and then retreated behind clouds that promised more snow. Word spread that the railroad had given up trying to clear the tracks until March. The hotel closed. The bakery stayed dark. The grocery on Main put up a sign that read, "No deliveries until further notice," and then closed its doors. Evelyn began to have visitors in the evenings. Not the men who had come before, but women. Mrs. Vance came first with a basket of needlework she offered to trade. Evelyn took the needlework and gave her dried rounds and a jar of lard. Mrs. Vance cried. A young woman named Sarah Bell, whose husband had gone to Omaha in November and had not been able to return, came with a baby on her hip and nothing in her hands. Evelyn gave her a small sack of tubers and told her to come back if she needed more. Sarah Bell tried to offer her wedding ring. Evelyn refused it. She gave until the dried rounds were gone. She gave until the sand crates were half empty, and then she stopped. She sat at her kitchen table with a pencil and paper and calculated what she had left. 10 pounds of whole tubers in the cellar, buried in damp sand, waiting for spring. 2 pounds of dried rounds in a tin. A quarter sack of cornmeal. A small crock of lard. 3 jars of pickled beans. And the patch outside still buried under 6 feet of snow, unreachable, unknowable. She had enough for herself and Pearl for maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month if she stretched, but the town was still hungry. And she was the only one who had anything. On a gray afternoon in the middle of March, a sound came that Evelyn had not heard in weeks. A horse. She went to the door and saw a rider coming up the lane, picking his way through the slush that had begun to form on top of the packed snow. He was a young man she did not recognize, with a leather satchel slung across his chest and a look of urgency on his face. He reined in at her door and introduced himself as a telegraph operator from the line that ran between Council Bluffs and Omaha. The line had been down for weeks, he said, but they had just managed to get a temporary repair. And there was a message for her. He handed her a slip of paper. She unfolded it and read it twice before the words made sense. Stop laughing. Stop sending samples. Stop buying your entire crop. Stop Omega Restaurant. Stop. Mr. Farnham. Stop. 15 cents per pound. Stop. Reply immediately. Stop. Evelyn stood in the slush with the telegram in her hand, and the young man waited, and Pearl snuffled at her feet, and the wind blew cold across the bottomlands. 15 cents per pound, the entire crop. The traveling salesman from Omaha, who had bought a sack of her tubers from Mr. Steinberg's window back in November, had sold them to a restaurant on Farnham Street, and the restaurant wanted more, all of it, at 3 times the price she had been charging in town. She looked at the patch under the snow. She looked at the cellar with its 10 pounds of seed stock. She looked at the telegram again, and she thought of the town that had laughed at her, mocked her, doubted her, and now relied on her. The town that had called her a fool for buying a pig she could not eat. The town that had watched her struggle and offered only judgment. She could take the telegram to Omaha. She could sell the entire crop, the buried patch, the cellar stock, everything, for 15 cents a pound. She could walk away from this frozen ground, from the tired soil and the leaning coop, and the memories of her parents, and she could start over somewhere warm, somewhere where people did not laugh at a woman for following her heart. She folded the telegram and put it in her pocket. She thanked the young man. She went inside and sat by the stove, and Pearl came and laid her head on Evelyn's lap. And Evelyn looked down at her and remembered the quarter she had spent, the small, shivering body tucked inside her coat, the muddy snout rooting in the forgotten patch. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Pearl looked at her with her bright black eyes, and her tail wagged once, slow and certain, as if she knew something Evelyn did not. And in that moment a knock came at the door. The knock came again, harder this time, and Evelyn rose from the chair with Pearl following close at her heels. She opened the door to find Mrs. Vance standing in the twilight, her face wet with something that was not snow. Behind her, the 3 children huddled together like calves in a storm, the youngest, Henry, clinging to his mother's skirt. Mrs. Vance did not speak at first. She only stood there, and the silence told Evelyn everything she needed to know. "Come in," Evelyn said, and she stepped aside. The Vance children filed past her, their boots leaving puddles on the floorboards. Henry looked around the cabin with wide eyes until he spotted Pearl, and his face cracked into the first smile Evelyn had seen on a child in weeks. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around the pig's neck, and Pearl, who had never met a stranger she did not like, leaned into the embrace and let out a soft, grunting sigh. Mrs. Vance sat down at the table and pressed her hands flat against the wood, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "We have nothing left," she said. Her voice was not dramatic, not pleading. It was flat, the voice of a woman who had passed through worry and arrived at a kind of exhausted clarity. "The cornmeal ran out 3 days ago. I boiled the last of the dried beans this morning. The children had a cup each. There is nothing else." Evelyn looked at the Vance children. The oldest, a girl of 10 named Martha, stood by the stove with her hands tucked into her sleeves, her collarbones sharp against her dress. The middle child, a boy of 8 named Samuel, leaned against the wall with his eyes half closed, and Henry, still on the floor with Pearl, looked up at Evelyn with a trust that made her chest ache. "Stay here," Evelyn said. She went to the cellar and came back with a basket. In it, she placed 2 pounds of dried rounds, a jar of lard, and a small sack of whole tubers from the sand crates, not the seed stock, but the ones she had been saving for her own table. She set the basket in front of Mrs. Vance. "This will get you through a week," she said. "When it runs out, come back. I will have more by then." Mrs. Vance looked at the basket. Her chin trembled. "Evelyn, I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to. I will pay you in the summer. I will work your garden. I will sew you a dress. I will do whatever you need." "Then you will," Evelyn said, "but not tonight. Tonight you will take this home and feed your children." Mrs. Vance rose, and she took Evelyn's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without speaking. Then she gathered her children, and they filed out into the dusk, Henry still looking back at Pearl until the door closed. Evelyn stood at the window and watched them walk up the lane, small shapes growing smaller against the white horizon, and she felt a weight settle into her bones that was not exhaustion and not sadness. It was something harder. It was the knowledge that the Vance family would be back in a week, and that a dozen other families were in the same condition, and that her cellar could not feed them all. She took the telegram from her pocket and read it again. 15 cents per pound, entire crop. Reply immediately. She could sell everything to the restaurant in Omaha. She could take the money and buy flour and sugar and salt pork, enough to feed herself and Pearl and a dozen others through the spring. She could become the supplier the town needed, not the woman who gave away her food in baskets. The money would give her leverage, options, independence. She could hire help. She could expand the patch. She could build a real farm. But the restaurant wanted the entire crop, every tuber, every dried round, everything. And if she sold it all, she would have nothing to plant in the spring, nothing to give the Vances when they returned, nothing for the families who would come knocking when word spread that the Harper girl had food and the stores did not. She folded the telegram and put it back in her pocket. She would answer tomorrow. Tonight, she needed to think. The next morning, a second rider came. This one was not the telegraph operator. He was a man in a heavy coat and a fur hat, riding a horse that looked as tired as he did. He introduced himself as Mr. Farnham's agent, sent from Omaha to negotiate directly. He had ridden through the slush and the mud to reach her before she made any other arrangements. He sat at her table and drank her weak tea and laid out the terms. 18 cents per pound now, cash on delivery. A wagon would be sent as soon as the roads were passable. He spread the silver dollars on the table to show he meant business. $20 as a deposit, the rest upon pickup. Evelyn looked at the silver. She had never seen so much money in one place. It could buy a new roof, a new cow, a new life. It could buy her freedom from the soil that had taken her parents and left her with nothing but a pig and a patch of weeds. "Give me a week," she said. The agent frowned. "Mr. Farnham is eager to secure the supply. He has competitors who are also interested. Then tell him he can have the crop in a week, or he can have nothing. Those are my terms." The agent studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, gathered his deposit, and rode away. Evelyn watched him go and felt the weight of the week settle around her. 7 days to decide. 7 days to dig the patch, if she meant to dig it. 7 days to figure out what kind of woman she was going to be. She went out to the backyard that afternoon with a shovel. The snow had begun to melt in earnest, the top layer turning to slush, the ground beneath still frozen hard. She drove the shovel into the crust, and it bounced off the packed earth like iron against stone. The patch was locked. She could not reach it, not yet, not until the sun did its work. She stood in the slush with the shovel in her hands, and felt the frustration rise hot in her throat. That night, Mrs. Strand came again. She did not knock. She simply appeared in the doorway, stooped and wrapped in her 3 shawls, and she carried a bundle that she set on the table without a word. Inside were 2 dozen eggs, a slab of salt pork, and a jar of pickled beets, luxuries Evelyn had not seen since before the blizzard. "Where did you get these?" Evelyn asked. "I have my ways," Mrs. Strand said. "You are not the only one who knows how to keep food through the winter. I have a cold cellar under the sod. It has kept things for me since before you were born. But I am old, and I cannot eat it all. You have people coming to your door. Feed them." Evelyn looked at the eggs. She looked at the salt pork. She felt a lump rise in her throat that she could not swallow. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Strand nodded once. She did not sit down, did not accept tea. She only looked at Evelyn with her sharp blue eyes and said, "That pig of yours, she found the patch." "She did. The animals always know. The land remembers. Your mother's book had it right. You listen to that pig, and you will be all right." And then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Evelyn alone with the eggs and the salt pork, and the weight of a week that was already slipping away. By the 3rd day of her week, the thaw had begun in earnest. The temperature rose above freezing and stayed there, and the snow turned to water that ran in sheets across the yard. The river groaned and shifted, chunks of ice grinding against each other as the current found its way through. Evelyn went out each morning and tested the patch with her shovel, and each morning the ground was a little softer, a little more forgiving. On the 4th day, the shovel broke through. She hit soil, dark and damp, and she dropped to her knees and scooped it up in her hands and felt the cold, crumbly evidence of spring. She dug that afternoon. She dug until her shoulders ached and her fingers cramped around the handle. The tubers came up in clusters, pale and firm, connected by thin roots that stretched through the dark earth like threads of a hidden web. She filled 2 baskets, then 3, then 4. She worked by lantern light after the sun went down, and Pearl rooted alongside her, snout deep in the turned soil, unearthing strays that Evelyn had missed. By midnight, she had a pile of tubers that covered half the yard, and she sat down on the cold ground with her back against the cabin wall and looked at what she had done. There was enough here to answer Mr. Farnham's offer. There was enough to keep her seed stock and still sell 1,000 pounds. There was enough, she realized with a strange, quiet awe, to feed the town. She was still sitting there when the moon rose, full and white, and the ice on the river cracked like a gunshot. The sound echoed across the bottomlands, and Evelyn felt it in her chest. She looked toward the river, and in the moonlight she saw that the ice had broken in a long, jagged line from bank to bank. The water was moving, dark and fast, and she watched it for a long time, understanding something she had not understood before. The winter was ending, but what came next would not be easy. The thaw would bring mud and flood and rot. The stores in town were empty. The railroad would not run for another 2 weeks at least. And in the gap between the melting snow and the first planting, the town would need food more than it had ever needed it before. She went inside and wrote a letter to Mr. Farnham's agent. She told him she would sell him 300 pounds at 18 cents, delivered as soon as the roads were passable. The rest, she said, was not for sale. She sealed the letter and set it on the mantel, and she went to sleep with Pearl snoring at the foot of her bed and the smell of damp earth filling the cabin. The next morning, before she could send the letter, the river flooded. It came without warning, or what warning there was came too late. The ice jammed downstream, and the water backed up over the banks, and by midday the bottomlands were a sheet of brown water that rose inch by inch, covering the lane, covering the fence line, creeping toward the cabin. Evelyn stood on her porch and watched the water spread across her yard, and she felt a cold panic that she had not felt since the night Pearl fell sick. The patch she had just dug, was on high ground, but the rest of the property was low, and the water was rising. She began to move. She carried the baskets of tubers into the cabin, stacking them on the table, on the chairs, on the loft floor. She carried the sand crates from the cellar and set them on the porch, then thought better of it and dragged them inside. Pearl followed her, anxious and uncertain, her trotters slipping on the wet boards. The water reached the doorstep by evening, and Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed with Pearl pressed against her side and watched the dark water lap at the threshold. And she waited. The flood stayed for 3 days. It did not reach the cabin floor. The doorstep was the highest point, but it covered the yard, the lane, the old garden patch that had not yet been dug. The water was brown and slow and carried debris, fence posts, a chicken coop from somewhere upriver, the carcass of a cow that floated past on the second day and lodged against the leaning fence. Evelyn watched it all from her window, and she thought about the families upriver, the Brennan spread, the Vance farm, the low-lying fields where the wheat had been planted in the fall. The flood would have taken everything. The homes on higher ground might have survived, but the fields, the root cellars, the stored hay, all of it would be underwater. On the third day, the water began to recede. It fell as quickly as it had risen, leaving behind a landscape transformed. The yard was covered in mud and debris. The fence was gone. The lane was a trench of silt, and the patch that Evelyn had not dug, the part she had left for seed, was buried under a foot of slimy brown muck. She walked out into the mud that afternoon, sinking to her ankles, and she stood over the buried patch and felt the hope drain out of her. The seed stock was gone. The tubers she had saved for planting were either washed away or buried so deep she would never find them. She had the baskets in the cabin, the 300 pounds she had promised to Mr. Farnham. That was all. No spring crop, no future harvest, no second chance. She sat down in the mud, right there in the middle of the yard, and she cried. She cried for her parents, for the cabin, for the piglet she had bought with her last quarter, for the garden that had saved her and was now ruined. She cried until she had nothing left, and then she sat in the cold mud with her hands limp in her lap and stared at the brown water that still covered the bottom of the lane. Pearl came out of the cabin and stood beside her. She nudged Evelyn's shoulder with her wet snout. She grunted, soft and questioning. Evelyn looked at her, this pig that had grown from a trembling runt into a solid, steady presence. And she remembered the first time she had seen her root in the old patch, the careless confidence with which she had turned up the first tuber. She remembered Mrs. Strand's words, "The animals always know." She stood up. She wiped the mud from her hands. She walked to the edge of the buried patch, and she looked at the muck, and she thought about what her mother had written. "Watch what the animals show you." And she thought about Pearl, how she had always been drawn to that patch, how she had rooted there for hours, even after Evelyn had stopped paying attention. She turned and walked to the high ground, to the spot where the flood had not reached, where the baskets of tubers sat stacked in her cabin. She picked one up, a fat, knobby specimen, pale and firm, and she looked at it. Then she looked at the mud that covered the old patch, and she made a decision. She would not sell to Mr. Farnham. She would not take the money. She would take the tubers she had dug, and she would plant them. Not in the old patch, that was ruined. She would plant them in the higher ground, the land above the flood line, the land her father had said was too rocky for corn. She would plant them in the soil that no one else wanted, and she would wait, and when the town needed her, she would be ready. She went into the cabin and took the letter from the mantel. She did not tear it up. She folded it and put it in the stove, and she watched it burn. Then she washed her face, put on her coat, and walked through the mud to the Vance farm to tell them that she had enough to share. The mud sucked at Evelyn's boots with every step, pulling at her heels as if the earth itself did not want her to leave. The lane was gone, lost under a carpet of brown silt that stretched from fence line to fence line, and she had to pick her way along the high ground where the grass still showed through. The Vance farm sat on a slight rise, 1.5 miles from her own cabin, and she had walked that path 100 times in better years. Now it felt like crossing a battlefield. The flood had left its mark everywhere: a plow half buried in the muck, a child's doll hanging from a tree branch where the water had carried it, the carcass of a sheep lodged against a stone wall. She passed the Brennan spread on the higher ground, and she saw Clay Brennan standing on his porch, staring out at the brown expanse that had been his hayfield. He did not wave, he did not call out. He only stood there, a solitary figure against the gray sky, and Evelyn felt the weight of his silence like a stone. The Vance farm was still standing. The cabin sat on a knoll that had stayed above the waterline, and the yard was a churned mess of mud and footprints. Mrs. Vance came to the door before Evelyn reached it, wiping her hands on her apron, her face drawn but not defeated. Behind her, Henry appeared, peaked and pale, but his eyes lit up when he saw Evelyn. "Did Pearl come?" he asked. "She stayed home to guard the cabin," Evelyn said, and Henry laughed, a thin, surprised sound that seemed to startle even him. Inside, the cabin was damp and cold. The stove had been lit, but the wood was wet and gave off more smoke than heat. The youngest child, Martha, sat on a stool with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Samuel was carving a piece of driftwood with a dull knife. The baby, a girl of barely 2, slept in a cradle near the stove, her breath coming in soft, even puffs. Mrs. Vance set the kettle on and turned to face Evelyn with a look that was half gratitude and half wariness. "We used the last of what you gave us," she said. "The children have had nothing but broth for 2 days." Evelyn had brought a sack. She set it on the table and untied the drawstring. Inside were 20 pounds of tubers, scrubbed clean, pale, and firm. "This will last you 2 weeks if you stretch it," she said. "I will bring more when I can." Mrs. Vance looked at the tubers. She did not cry this time. She simply nodded and began to lift them out, setting them on the shelf in neat rows, as if she were arranging a gift that she meant to make last as long as possible. "We heard the river flooded your bottomland," she said. "They say you lost the patch." "I lost the part I had not dug yet," Evelyn said. "But I saved what I had already harvested. I still have 300 pounds in my cabin." 300 pounds. That is enough to feed us all through the spring. It is enough to feed us if we are careful. But it is not enough to plant. The seed stock was in the part of the patch that is buried under mud now. Mrs. Vance stopped arranging the tubers. She turned and looked at Evelyn, and in that look there was something Evelyn had not seen in a long time. Not pity, not judgment, but the steady, patient understanding of a woman who had also lost things. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will plant the high ground," Evelyn said, "the land above the flood line where my father said nothing would grow. I will plant the best of the tubers I saved, and I will hope." Mrs. Vance was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I will help you. When the ground is ready, I will bring the children, and we will dig." Evelyn walked home through the mud with a weight lifted from her shoulders that she had not realized she was carrying. She had not come to ask for help. She had come to give it. But the offer had been made, and she had taken it. And somehow that made the path ahead feel less impossible. The next 2 weeks were a battle against the clock. The ground needed to dry enough to work, but the days were warming, and the first green shoots were already pushing up through the mud in the low places. Evelyn marked out a plot on the high ground behind the cabin, a rocky, uneven stretch of land that her father had tried once with potatoes and abandoned after a single season. She cleared the stones by hand, piling them along the edge of the field in a low wall. She broke the clods with a mattock, working until her palms blistered and bled. Pearl followed her everywhere, rooting in the turned soil, unearthing rocks that Evelyn had missed, her grunts a steady rhythm that kept Evelyn company through the long, solitary hours. On the third day, the Vance children came. Martha and Samuel arrived first, carrying a basket of cornbread and a jar of honey, a gift from their mother. They worked beside Evelyn without complaint, their small hands picking stones from the soil, their voices filling the quiet with the chatter that Evelyn had not known she missed. Henry came later, trailing behind his mother, and he spent the afternoon sitting in the dirt with Pearl, talking to her in a low, earnest voice about matters that Evelyn did not try to overhear. By the end of the first week, the field was ready. Evelyn had saved 50 pounds of the best tubers for planting, fat, firm specimens with multiple eyes, the kind her grandmother would have called seed worth keeping. She cut them into pieces, each with at least 2 eyes, and let them sit on the porch for a day to callus over, as Mrs. Strand had taught her. Then, on a cool morning with the sun just breaking over the river, she knelt in the rocky soil and began to plant, one piece at a time, pressing them into the earth with the careful reverence of a woman who understood what she was doing. Mrs. Strand came on the second day of planting. She did not offer help. She stood at the edge of the field with her arms folded and watched Evelyn work. After a long silence, she said, "You are planting in rocks." "Yes, ma'am." "Your father said nothing would grow here." "I know." Mrs. Strand nodded once, slowly. Then she walked into the field and knelt down beside Evelyn. She took a piece of cut tuber from the basket and pressed it into the soil with her own hands, covering it with a practiced motion that spoke of decades of experience. She did not say another word. She worked alongside Evelyn until the sun was high, and then she stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and walked away without looking back. The Brennan boys came on the third day. They did not work. They stood on the lane and watched, their horses stamping in the mud. Clay Brennan was silent, but Jim could not hold his tongue. "Planting rocks now, Miss Harper?" he called out. "That is a new one. What will you grow, stone crop?" Evelyn did not answer. She kept her eyes on the soil, her hands steady. Pearl, who had been rooting at the edge of the field, lifted her head and looked at the Brennan boys with a long, unblinking stare that seemed to make Jim shift in his saddle. "Come on," Clay said, and he turned his horse. Jim followed, but he looked back over his shoulder, and his face was not mocking. It was curious, almost uneasy, as if he had seen something he did not understand and could not dismiss. The planting took 4 days. Evelyn set the tubers in rows that followed the contours of the high ground, spacing them a foot apart, covering them with 3 inches of soil. She marked the rows with stakes and string, and she watered them from the rain barrel when the sky stayed dry for too long. She talked to them the way her mother had talked to her garden, low and encouraging, as if the words themselves could coax growth from the unyielding soil. And then she waited. The waiting was the hardest part. The days stretched on, warm and gray, and the field remained bare. Evelyn checked it every morning, kneeling at the edge of the rows, looking for the first sign of green. Nothing came. The soil stayed dark and still. The rocks that she had piled along the edges seemed to mock her, their gray surfaces catching the light like the faces of silent judges. In town, the situation grew worse. The railroad had been repaired, but the supply trains were slow, and the stores remained empty. The baker had not reopened. The hotel was running on reduced rations. Children were thin, and the elderly were weaker, And the talk in the streets was not about planting or harvest, but about survival. Mr. Steinberg closed his grocery on Main Street and put a sign in the window that said, "Gone to Omaha. Will return when there is something to sell." The postmaster's wife took down the sign and wrote her own. "If you have food, bring it. If you need food, ask." Evelyn saw that sign when she went into town to buy a sack of salt, and she stood on the sidewalk and read it twice. And then she walked to the post office and left a basket of tubers on the counter without a word. The Reverend Coffey came to see her on a Sunday afternoon. He did not bring judgment this time. He brought a list. It was written on a sheet of lined paper in a careful, trembling hand, and it contained the names of every family in the congregation that had less than a week's worth of food. There were 14 names. "The flood took the low fields," he said. "The Brennan boys lost their spring planting. The Vance family has nothing but what you gave them. The widow Hargrove is living on dandelion greens. I have not been able to help them, Evelyn. The church has no stores. But you have food, and I have come to ask you, not to command you, but to ask you what you can spare." Evelyn looked at the list. She knew every name on it. Some of them had laughed at her. Some of them had mocked her for the pig, for the patch, for the foolish hope that had kept her alive through the winter. But they were also the families who had brought stew after her mother died, who had patched her roof, who had nodded to her in the street even when they thought she was making a mistake. "I have 300 pounds of tubers in my cabin," she said. "I have planted 50 pounds on the high ground, and I am waiting for them to come up. If they do not come up, I will have nothing left but what I have stored. If they do come up, I will have a harvest in the fall." The Reverend Coffey waited. "I will give you 50 pounds for the families on this list," she said. "That is all I can spare and still keep enough to feed myself through the summer. When the harvest comes, if it comes, I will give more." The Reverend Coffey closed his eyes. He was a thin man, worn thin by the winter and the hunger and the weight of his congregation's suffering. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. "Thank you," he said. "I will tell them." "I will tell them it came from you." "You do not have to tell them that." "I will tell them anyway." He left with a basket of tubers, and Evelyn stood on her porch and watched him walk down the lane, his black coat frayed at the hem, his shoulders bent but not broken. She thought about the 14 families on the list. She thought about the 50 pounds she had given away. And she thought about the 50 pounds she had planted, waiting beneath the soil for a sign that the earth had not abandoned her. The next morning she went out to the high field, and she saw the first green shoot pushing up through the rocks. It was small, barely an inch high, pale and tender, but it was there. Evelyn dropped to her knees and touched it with the tip of her finger, as if she were afraid it would vanish. Pearl came up behind her and snuffled at the shoot, then grunted and moved on, as if she had known all along that it would appear. By the end of the week, the field was covered in green. The shoots came up thick and fast, pushing through the rocky soil with a determination that seemed almost stubborn. Evelyn walked the rows each morning and counted them, and each morning there were more. She watered them, weeded them, talked to them. She did not tell anyone what was happening. She kept the secret close, like a coal cupped in her hands, afraid that speaking it aloud would make it vanish. But secrets do not stay hidden in a small town. The Vance children saw the green from the lane. The Brennan boys, riding past on their way to the high meadow, stopped and stared. Mrs. Pickering, who had not spoken to Evelyn since the confrontation in the cabin, passed by on her way to the post office and saw the field from a distance. She did not come closer. She did not say a word. But she stopped on the lane, and she looked, and after a long moment she turned and walked away with something new in her step. The morning of the first real harvest, Evelyn woke before dawn. She stood on her porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun rise over the high field. And she saw that the plants had grown taller than her waist. They were not the sprawling, weedy stalks she had expected. They were straight and strong, with broad leaves and sturdy stems, and they swayed in the morning breeze like a green ocean. She walked into the field and knelt beside the first row. She slid her hands into the soil at the base of the nearest stalk, and she felt what she had been waiting for, a resistance, a fullness, the round firmness of tubers pushing against the earth. She pulled, and the plant came up, and the roots were heavy with pale, knobby tubers, a dozen of them, fat and perfect. She held them in her hands, still damp with soil, and she laughed. She laughed the way she had laughed the night she found the first patch, a full, free sound that echoed across the bottomlands and startled a flock of blackbirds from the trees. Pearl came running, her ears flapping, and she circled Evelyn with short, excited grunts, as if she understood exactly what had happened. The harvest took 3 days. Evelyn worked from dawn until dusk, filling basket after basket, stacking them on the porch until there was no room to walk. She worked alone, but on the second day, the Vance children came, and they helped. On the third day, Mrs. Strand came, and she brought her 2 old neighbors, and they worked in silence with the quiet efficiency of people who knew the rhythm of a harvest. By the end of the third day, Evelyn had over 1,000 pounds of tubers, clean and dry, stacked in crates and baskets and barrels. She stood in the middle of her yard, surrounded by the fruit of her labor, and she felt something she had not felt since her parents were alive. She felt safe. She felt strong. She felt like the woman she had always been trying to become. And then, on the 4th morning, a wagon came up her lane. It was not a farmer's wagon. It was a sleek black buggy, polished and clean, and the man driving it wore a suit and a silk tie. He pulled up in front of her cabin and stepped down, and he introduced himself as Mr. Farnham's personal representative, sent from Omaha to make her an offer she could not refuse. "I am prepared to pay 20 cents a pound for your entire harvest," he said. "Cash, today." Evelyn looked at the crates of tubers on her porch. She looked at the field, stripped bare, the stalks already beginning to wither. She looked at the list of 14 families, still pinned to the wall inside her cabin. She looked at the buggy, the suit, the silk tie, and the cash in the man's hand. And she thought about the winter, the hunger, the flood, the girls who had trusted her. "I am sorry," she said. "The harvest is not for sale." The man's face hardened. "Miss Harper, you are making a mistake." "Maybe," she said, "but it is my mistake to make." She turned and walked back into her cabin, and she closed the door behind her. But as she stood in the quiet kitchen, with Pearl's warm head pressed against her leg and the smell of earth and onions still clinging to her hands, she knew that the hardest part was only just beginning. The town was watching, the town was waiting, and the town was hungry. The morning after the agent from Omaha drove away, Evelyn stood on her porch and watched the sun rise over the high field. The stalks had been cut, the tubers harvested, and the ground lay bare and brown, waiting for whatever came next. She had refused 20 cents a pound. She had turned away more money than she had seen in her entire life. And she had done it because she had looked at the list of 14 families and known that she could not sell their survival for silk ties and polished buggies. The town did not understand at first. When word spread that the Harper girl had turned down a fortune, the talk that followed was not gratitude. It was bewilderment, then suspicion. Mrs. Pickering, who had not spoken to Evelyn since the confrontation in the cabin, found her voice again in the sewing circle. "She refused good money," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She could have saved herself. She could have bought a new roof, a new cow, a new life. Instead, she sat on her harvest like a hen on a nest, and now it will rot." The women nodded. They did not know what else to do. They were hungry, and the only person in the county with food had refused to sell it to a man who would have taken it all away. But the harvest did not rot. Evelyn stored it the way Mrs. Strand had taught her, in damp sand in the cellar, in crates in the loft, in the cool shadow of the north wall where the sun never reached. She kept 50 pounds for her own table and set aside 300 pounds for the families on the list. The rest she held in reserve, waiting for the moment when the town would need it most. That moment came in the 2nd week of April. A late frost swept down from the north, a cruel visitation that blackened the tender shoots of every garden in the valley. The Brennan boys lost the corn they had planted after the floodwaters receded. The Vance family's potato patch turned to mush overnight. The widow Hargrove's bean vines withered on their stakes. And the railroad, which had promised a shipment of flour and salt pork, sent word that a bridge had washed out near Omaha, and delivery would be delayed by another 2 weeks. The town held its breath. The stores were empty, the gardens were dead, The railroad was stalled, and Evelyn Harper had 1,000 pounds of tubers in her cellar. She did not wait for them to come to her. She loaded her wagon with baskets and drove into town, and she set up a table on the corner of Pearl Street in Maine. She hung a sign that said, "Jerusalem artichokes, 3 cents per pound, while they last." The price was less than half of what she had charged in the fall, less than a quarter of what the Omaha restaurant had offered. She did not care. She was not selling for profit. She was selling because people needed to eat. The first customers came slowly, hesitantly, as if they were afraid the food would disappear if they reached for it. Old Mr. Whitaker, who had not spoken to Evelyn since her father's funeral, bought 10 pounds and paid with coins that he counted out one by one from a leather pouch. Mrs. Bell, the young woman with the baby, came and bought 5 pounds and pressed Evelyn's hand with a grip that said everything her mouth could not. The postmaster's wife bought 20 pounds and said she would spread the word. By noon, the line stretched down the block. By evening, Evelyn had sold 200 pounds. She drove home through the dusk with an empty wagon and a leather pouch full of coins. But the weight she felt was not the weight of money. It was the weight of 100 small glances, 100 quiet thanks, 100 pairs of eyes that looked at her not with mockery, but with something she had never seen from them before: respect. She came back the next day, and the next. On the third day, Mrs. Pickering appeared at the edge of the crowd. She stood apart from the line, her arms folded, her face set in the hard lines of a woman who had spent a lifetime being right and could not bear to be wrong. Evelyn saw her. She did not call out. She did not wave. She simply continued weighing tubers and taking coins, and she waited. The line dwindled. Mrs. Pickering stayed. When the last customer walked away with a basket of tubers, Mrs. Pickering stepped forward. She did not reach into her purse. She stood in front of Evelyn's table, and she looked at the remaining baskets, and she looked at Evelyn, and for a long moment she did not speak. "I have nothing to trade," Mrs. Pickering said finally. "I spent my last money on flour that turned out to be weevilled. I have no eggs, no preserves, no salt pork. I have nothing." Evelyn looked at her. The old woman's hands were trembling. Her coat was thin. Her face, which had always seemed carved from stone, was soft now, the lines deeper, the eyes hollow. "I do not need you to trade," Evelyn said. She reached into a basket and lifted out 10 pounds of tubers, the best ones, firm and clean. She wrapped them in a cloth and held them out. "Take these." Mrs. Pickering stared at the bundle. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to. I left your basket on the porch. I let it freeze. I called you a fool to anyone who would listen." "I know." "And you are giving me food?" "I am giving you food because you are hungry. That is the only reason I need." Mrs. Pickering took the bundle. Her hands shook as she held it against her chest, and her chin trembled, and for a moment Evelyn thought she might cry. But she did not. She only stood there, holding the cloth-wrapped tubers, and she said in a voice so quiet that Evelyn had to lean forward to hear it, "Evelyn Harper, I was wrong about you. I was wrong from the very beginning, and I am sorry." The words hung in the air between them, small and fragile and enormous. Evelyn felt a knot in her chest loosen, something she had been carrying since the day she had bought the piglet, since the day Mrs. Pickering had said, "Mercy, don't fill a stomach in the dry goods store." She did not know what to say. She did not have to say anything. Mrs. Pickering nodded once, a slow, solemn motion, and then she turned and walked away, the bundle clutched to her chest like a child. The next morning, the Reverend Coffey came to Evelyn's cabin. He did not bring a list. He brought a proposal. The town council, he said, wanted to buy the rest of her harvest at a fair price and distribute it to every family in need. They would pay her 5 cents a pound, the same price the baker had paid in the winter. They would take whatever she could spare, and they would store it in the church basement, and they would make sure that no family in Council Bluffs went hungry through the spring. Evelyn agreed. She sold them the rest of her harvest, 350 pounds, and she watched the men from the council load the crates onto a wagon and drive them away. She did not count the money. She put it in the leather pouch and set it on the mantel, and she did not look at it again. The town made it through the spring. The railroad bridge was repaired. The stores reopened. The gardens were replanted. And in the rocky field behind Evelyn's cabin, the second planting took root and grew, taller and stronger than the first. The neighbors came to watch. The Vance children came to help. Mrs. Strand came to sit on the porch and nod with satisfaction. And Pearl, full-grown now and grand as a queen, lay in the shade of the apple tree and snored through the warm afternoons. By the summer of 1894, Evelyn Harper was known up and down the river as the woman who grew the strange brown vegetables. She had a steady arrangement with the German baker and a contract with the Grand Hotel. She had taught Mrs. Vance how to grow them in her own yard, and Mrs. Vance had taught 2 other neighbors, and the strange brown vegetable was becoming slowly a thing people knew about. The Brennan boys, when they passed her on the lane, touched their hats and did not laugh. Mrs. Pickering came to call on the first Sunday of every month, and she brought whatever she could spare, a jar of jam, a loaf of bread, a piece of news, and she sat at Evelyn's table and drank tea, and they talked about the weather and the river and the things that grew in the ground. On a bright morning in October of 1895, 3 years to the day from the morning she had bought the runt piglet for 25 cents, Evelyn Harper stood in her yard with a basket on her hip and looked out over 6 acres of yellow sunflower blooms on tall green stalks, every one of them with 100 weight of tubers growing patient and hidden beneath. The field stretched from the cabin to the river, a sea of gold under a blue sky, and the bees moved among the flowers with the lazy industry of a world that had no hurry. Pearl, full-grown now and grand as a queen, lay in the shade of the apple tree, her sides rising and falling in the slow rhythm of a creature who had nothing to fear. Her ears flopped over her eyes, and her trotters twitched in her sleep, and Evelyn thought she might have been dreaming of roots. The cabin had a new roof. The lean-to had become a proper barn. The chicken coop housed 24 hens, and the milk cow was young and strong. Evelyn sat down her basket. She closed her eyes. She turned her face to the sun, and she laughed. The long, full laugh of a woman who had been right when nobody believed, who had trusted a piglet and a patch of weeds, and who had found, in the hard soil of a forgotten garden, a life that was richer than anything the town had ever imagined for her. She opened her eyes and looked at the field. Then she looked at Pearl, still sleeping in the shade, and she remembered the quarter she had spent, the small, shivering body she had tucked inside her coat, the muddy snout that had first broken the crust of the old garden. She knelt beside the pig and laid her hand on the warm, bristly side, and Pearl opened one dark eye and grunted, soft and low. The field bloomed behind them. The river ran. The town that had laughed had learned to grow what she had found, and the woman who had been called a fool had become the one they came to for advice. And in the kitchen, pinned to the mantel beside the paid tax receipt, was a single dried tuber from the very first harvest, a small brown knot of a thing that Evelyn had kept as a reminder. When visitors asked about it, she only smiled and said, "That is where it all began." But when she was alone, she would sometimes take it down and hold it in her palm, and she would remember the cold October morning, the silver quarter, the piglet's cry, and she would feel again the quiet certainty that had moved her hand when every voice in her head had told her to hold back. "The land remembers what it has grown," her mother had written, and Evelyn Harper had learned to listen. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.